1 year ago, Kirby finally decided to make the next big step for the franchise and ventured into the intimidating third dimension for the first time properly. The lead up to the Forgotten Lands release was carefully planned and at least similarly well received by fans as well as critics. Gone were the days where Kirby was deprecated as yet another simple platformer and instead apprehended as something that could easily stay toe-to-toe with Mario. Followers knew however about the potential all along, but the Forgotten Land was not about pleasing the already existing fanbase. There was always the potential to be something more, and it was only in the hands of the creators to start jumping from the pool to the ocean. As we are now aware, this jump was more than worthwhile, with establishing the most successful title in the franchise within a couple of months. Of course, everyone then was rather pleased and there were only very few reluctant voices expressing frustration. Even the biggest follower cannot deny that recency bias is a thing though, especially if an entry makes a splash for the first time since ages. It happens with other franchises, and it's bound to happen with yours favorite as well. The only question that remains is to see what is left of the initial positive impression. Simply seeing everything through pink-colored glasses does indeed not do any good in the long run, and we have to go one step further back to observe if the Forgotten Land truly was as good as we remember. Before elaborating on the qualities of the game, it's important to pin down what actually qualifies as a good Kirby game and the connected expectations the series has to face. Naturally, this may differ from person to person, but if we condense the three most important aspects together, it should be something like accessibility, exploration, and staging. Newcomers expect a fairly easy experience which may be perfect for a child, whereas dedicated followers want to explore different worlds, use copy abilities and unravel secrets, and finally multi-phased boss fights as well as a grandiose climax. It was never stated officially, but by going through the most recent titles in the last decade, it's very safe to assume these three bullet points take a high place in the priority list when designing a new Kirby game. So how well is the first 3D entry holding up, or does it deserve to be forgotten? Accessibility shows you a different mask depending on who you are. Often the term is linked to something beginner-friendly, something a rookie could manage without any serious problems. On the other hand, accessibility can also mean giving you the means to overcome a brutal challenge without directly holding your hand. These are two sides of the same coin, yet Kirby often manages it to flip the coin however he likes. Right from the start, there's the choice between a beginner-friendly mode and the often falsely claimed hard counterpart. On first sight, it seems like we finally get the chance to go through a more challenging experience from the start and don't have to unlock an additional adventure with a more demanding aspiration for the player. This seemingly choice, however, is nothing but a trick, an easy hoax to let you think you can swap the coin. In reality, the Spring Breeze is a simple easy mode, whereas Wild mode portrays the regular game. Nothing about the level design or bosses is changed, and you only have half the energy, which seems to be the regular amount. Going from 2D into 3D is a dangerous step, especially considering the target group, so adding additional support wheels is fine by itself. After all, unlike in Star Allies, everyone is still required to actually face off every level, every obstacle and every boss. No one is going to beat the game for you, and considering how this is the first proper 3D title, it's a miracle how decently challenging the Forgotten Land sometimes tends to be. Obviously, it's still a far cry from an actual test of skill, but it strikes a nearly perfect balance by balancing the beginner-friendly nature with sheer endless creativity. There are moments where you just forget about not being challenged due to the constant flow of newly introduced ideas and excellent execution. The only reason why deleting the Spring Breeze mode completely would have been fine are some mechanics integrated into the Waddle Dee Town. Never before was it easier to buy all sorts of upgrades to make hard times a little more tolerable. Storing healing items, boosting yourself with drugs and enhancing copy abilities give you a decision how strong you wish to be, therefore rendering any additional easy mode obsolete. In the end, you would still have to collect coins, buy these items and carefully plan when to use them. Simply put, you would have to actually play the game instead of simply choosing a mode in the beginning. This doesn't mean there's no actual challenge though, as in classic Kirby fashion you unlock an extra adventure after finishing the main campaign. And I do have to say, this is probably one, if not the best extra mode any Kirby game witnessed so far. For once, it's actually canon to the overall story and directly follows the events from the final. Just like in any other entry, most of the levels are reimagined, show stronger enemies and add in some additional hurdles. On paper, there's nothing particularly new to this mode, but the reason why this works so well is how fast-paced yet fair it is. Collecting all the Leongar souls is supported by the fact that Elflin tells when you can leave an area, which again adds to the accessibility in an originally difficult environment. On top of that, most bosses got a substantial upgrade, some of them feeling nearly completely novel. There's never the exhausting feeling of having to go through 70% of the game again, because everything either looks visually pleasing, adds a big enough twist to the initial situation, or challenges you in a way the regular game never did. The same could be said about the camera, because for the first time it was something for the developers to worry about. Should we let the player handle the perspective or make it more focused and linear? The answer is obvious now, but a little more complicated. In most linear 3D games, no one has to handle the right stick due to how the layout of a level is designed. You can clearly see where to go, and there's nothing much more to explore or see in the first place, since it is all about the level design. Kirby and the Forgotten Land, however, strikes an interesting balance where it presents itself as an open-ended, exploration-based adventure, but is much more similar to the likes of a Super Mario 3D World. Not without reason did some people think until the release the Forgotten Land would have been a sandbox game, due to how cleverly the game uses the camera in cinematic shots. Think about the very first and maybe most iconic scene at the beginning, where Kirby enters the Forgotten Land and is introduced with the picturesque, yet abandoned scenery of an ancient civilization and proliferated nature. This isn't the only moment where the game takes over the work of moving a second stick, as you encounter many different panoramic shots, often put at the start of a level to witness the surprisingly beautiful visuals. I'm not trying to imply the graphics of a Kirby game are not capable of impressing players, but some moments are honestly outstanding looking and are only possible because the creators clearly knew what the player would and would not see by fixing the perspective. Another perfect example would be the boss fights. Even though Gorimondo is a massive enemy, you would originally think it makes more sense to spread out the view and make everything as visible as possible. Granted, this would make it hard for the player to see where Kirby is, but instead we got a close swarm's eye view to underline the difference of height between Kirby and the antagonist. On top of that, it lets the boss appear even more intimidating, which is ultimately used throughout the whole game. Take the mini-bosses for example. The camera is fixed, so there are no dynamic shifts or any focus on specific moves. The battle is therefore rather unspectacular, separating these enemies from the real deal and making them what they are, mini-bosses. However, switch the camera behind Kirby, scale up Wild Edge a little and you get a perfectly fine boss with only a few tweaks. Eventually, this sense for perspective runs through the whole game and is definitely more cleverly used than in most linear 3D platformer. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If the player doesn't have to worry about shifting the perspective to see something, the developers should use this opportunity as much as possible and consistently shift the view of the world in the most interesting way. Exploration was always one of the biggest strengths of the franchise. The series is not leaning as much into this direction as I would like to see, but the emphasis was always there. The possibilities are gifted with a whole new dimension and it's more interesting than ever how the Forgotten Land spaces its secrets. By introducing the most adorable collectibles so far, Waddle Dees constitute as the focus point this time and are not regular enemies in the courses. Most of them are fairly easy to obtain thanks to a little but appreciated feature of them crying when Kirby's nearby. Additionally, it's also possible to rescue even more of them by completing extra missions, which are often hidden until you beat a level once. These consist of simple and often rather obvious tasks, but force the player to keep an eye out even when the regular Waddle Dee is saved. You are probably aware of a certain behavior where you feel suspicious when there wasn't a collectible in a very long time, so you start to carefully explore your surroundings in case you might have missed something. This gamey attitude only happens because of the rules of the game and contradict with the natural habitual feeling of always exploring the area for interesting discoveries. Once the collectible is found, many players start to just rush to the end, proving that set collectibles dictate how the player is behaving. Adding additional hidden missions circumvent this problem because you never know what your mission might be. Besides, many little precious moments are often rewarded with the Waddle Dee. Want to climb the rocket and stay on top? Here's a Waddle Dee. It's reminiscent of old childhood days where points of interest simply attract you for appearing unreachable, and once you make it, you feel a sense of accomplishment, with the difference of being rewarded this time. You can clearly see a future, more open title that rewards every little jump and step, even if it's the most uneventful achievement. This sense of exploration only works if the level design complements the natural surroundings. Despite being the first proper 3D title, The Forgotten Land takes place in a somewhat realistic world and doesn't rely on the aesthetics of Dreamland. As a result, there are no magical platforms floating in the sky, and it's very interesting to see where each world takes place. While World 1 and 2 resemble a basic representation of a grassy and watery world, World 3 is where the game truly starts with an abandoned amusement park. Constantly you encounter more than one basic idea, and due to the theming of the world itself, it feels like you never truly know what to expect. There's even the believable shift from daytime through nighttime as you go through the park, and it's very safe to say that Wandaria is without a doubt one of the best designed worlds in the franchise. It's really hard to imagine how the developers went from Star Allies' average level design to this constant flow of quality platforming so effortlessly that you plainly understand the passion behind the project. But what would be a Kirby game without its copy abilities? This is an aspect where many players seem to agree on one of the seeming downsides of the game. There are only a few, and the moveset is shallow in comparison to past titles. It was clear from the start that copy abilities would go through a minor shift thanks to figuring out how they would work in 3D. Kirby Battle Royale gave us a first taste, but was portrayed from a set angle and, much to my surprise, didn't serve as a blueprint as much as I expected. There's no dedicated button for a dash attack, and skills like Tornado function much more differently. This is only logical since The Forgotten Land is a completely different game, and while we are missing out on classics like Beam, most of the abilities are translated rather well into the third dimension. Before, copy abilities resembled more of a fighting game, with direct inputs triggering certain attacks and special, more complicated inputs leading to stronger techniques. This isn't really possible this time as Kirby starts to run automatically, and it's much more complicated to register intended inputs in relation to the position of Kirby in a three-dimensional room. Consequently, many abilities are streamlined, with some of them only being able to perform 3 moves maximum. Initially, this comes off as a disappointment, since copy abilities were the bread and butter of modern Kirby movement, but you have to consider it more from a certain angle. In all of its lifetime, Kirby games slowly developed skills to what they are over the years, and Star Allies is basically the result of a perfected formula for 2D games. This is the first time the creators have to find out what works and what doesn't, and it can take a couple of games to figure out how to handle this side of Kirby. A fitting example would be the expanded and somewhat overpowered new dodge roll. In past titles, the dodge roll had a very narrow-minded movement window, and often it was much more safe to simply stay in shield and wait for the opponent to retreat or finish his attack. Because Kirby movement only consists of a jump, slide and floating, the new dodge roll was necessary to give the player a chance to swiftly dodge ambushes or other techniques. Silly Dillo is a perfect example of that scenario, since it would be quite anticlimactic for him to slowly roll towards you due to a missing dodging mechanic. Granted, the dodge roll is too strong, and once you figure it out how to properly use it, no boss will ever be a problem again, but still, it looks stylish and feels good to trigger. Copy abilities will go through a similar shift over time, which is proven by skills like the Mouthful Knight upgrade. There are various ways to release various moves, and this was the first time I felt like I was handling a copy ability akin to all the great 2D counterparts. In a similar fashion, the small number of overall skills is also understandable in consideration that many of them have a novelty to them thanks for shining in 3D. Tornado or Bow never felt truly satisfying to me because there's only so much you can do in a two-dimensional space, whereas Tornado in 3D or Gun unfold their movement options and potential in a more widespread area. It's all about perspective, and once I stopped expecting the same type of gameplay like in Star Allies, it clicked for me and I had much more fun playing around around. Who knows, in 10 years we will start to perform extended combos and wacky combinations just like Bayonetta. Copy abilities work if they are simply enjoying to use, but are perfect if they form a synergy with the level design. As fleshed out as they are in Star Allies, the developers commonly only concentrated on making Kirby move impressive, instead of requiring that movement to proceed in the level. Understandable, since it's possible to lose an ability at any time, but also shameful because there are so many options to design a level around a skill. In the Forgotten Ends case, for the first time it felt like the creators were aware of the limited moveset and tried to compensate for that by integrating them more directly into the level design. You come across many sections with focused challenges around certain skills for the first time, and it felt like the series is leaning towards a direction I always wanted to see. Newly introduced upgrades slightly negate the downside of a low number of skills by letting you transform abilities into more powerful and distinct versions. Some of them are mere improvements from the original and work the same, with others turning into nearly completely different types of skills. When designing a new copy ability for Kirby, there must be the problem of having ideas that are too similar to already existing ones, so by establishing non-identical but related enhancements, there's still the wonder of experiencing new skills, even if they are simply blueprinted. At first I wasn't quite sure about this feature, since it seemed like once upgraded, there's no reason to go back to the original state of an ability. While this might apply to some of them, I was pleasantly surprised to see how simply unique some upgrades are, to a point where you could call them alternatives instead. The biggest reason, however, why we only see a handful of copy abilities is the main feature, mouthful mode. Before the game's release, I was eager to see if there would be a main gimmick at all. After all, jumping into a full 3D seemed to be quite the selling point on its own, and if other games can sell a simple power-ups as distinguished features as well, it shouldn't be a problem for Kirby. On top of that, main gimmicks in platformers always run the risk of appearing forced, since the public eye needs a justification to buy the new game, other than superb level design or simply a well-crafted game on its own. I'm not here to bash Hypernova or the robot armor suit, since I found both of them rather enjoyable, but I'm honest enough to admit that they probably didn't contribute too much to the successful reputation of these entries. Especially the robot armor suit wasn't used for bosses, besides one or two exceptions, and didn't even make a playable appearance during the climax. Whatever you might think of Hypernova, at least the whole gimmick was simply worth for the final moment, no doubt. If you're a long-time viewer, then you're probably aware I wasn't spoiled about Mouthful until release. I saw some pictures about Kirby trying to swallow stuff he shouldn't swallow, or any person should swallow, but I could only guess what that was supposed to mean. It may have played into my enjoyment, but for the first time since ages, I experienced an actual advertised feature for the first time in a game. Imagine playing Mario Odyssey without knowing the capture mechanic. It was very unexpected seeing Kirby fully with context. Speaking about Odyssey, the influence here cannot be dismissed, since it works pretty much the same. Instead of simply copying the ability, Kirby becomes what he eats, changes the controls and his appearance. Initially, I wasn't quite sure how this feature would contribute to the overall game, and feared yet another entertaining but unnecessary gimmick. Luckily, this fear should quickly turn out to be wrong during the first minutes, since the way how mouthful mode is introduced immediately with a bang. It's often optional, transitions seamless into the game's flow, and is never heavily abused. Whenever encountering Hypernova or the robot armor suit, there was sometimes the feeling of, oh, now starts the gimmick section of the level, which cannot really be said about Mouthful. Of course, some sections force you to use this feature, but it's never predictably paced, and there's always this nice flow of regular gameplay swallowing questionable stuff. The main reason, however, why Mouthful works so amazing are two major factors: the controls and visuals. Maybe you remember playing Bowser in Mario Odyssey for the first time and be like, huh, why does this control so well? Basically the same happened with nearly every single Mouthful mold, and despite the fact how goofy most of them look, it's simply amazing how fantastic and floaty most of them control. What's even more important is how funny they appear. I must sound like a stupid child, but the comedic spin behind these visual transformations cannot be underestimated. And even though the gameplay potential should be your first thought when encountering a new object, I always looked forward to how utterly moronic Kirby can look. I was always of the opinion that humor in Kirby games is generally underutilized, so adding a bit of visual humor without actively trying to be funny fits the lighthearted explicit nature of the franchise so perfectly. Furthermore, you should never forget the target group of toddlers. It may not be that essential, but if children are able to easily draw the main characters of a children's series, you have probably nailed the character design. Easily outlining a car and just painting it pink with some eyes makes a mouthful Kirby, and I cannot stress enough how well thought out this main feature ultimately is. Still, copy abilities as well as the mouthful modes share the common trait of being introduced extremely early, I mean in their number. This comes with the downside of not encountering any new major copy abilities or M modes in the second half of the game, but it also means more fleshed out mechanics that are built up throughout the adventure. Gameplay wise, the whole adventure is proficiently thought out, and even if there is a decision you don't agree on, you can at least see the point, which is the best kind of disadvantage a game can probably have. If Star Allies is like the pineapple on a pizza, you either like it or hate it. Forgotten Land is like the pizza in general, everyone likes the bases, but might disagree on a few toppings. This video turned out to be rather long, so why not rest for a bit? How about a cup of tea? It helps digestion and improves your blood circulation. Well, the second part might be a lie, but you didn't question it, right? We are very proud you made it this far. You have a great attention span. Most viewers turn off after merely 10 seconds if the video doesn't capture their interest immediately. You think this might be a lie again? Don't worry, there's no need to verify such information. We could simply insult them right now, but they will not watch to this point. If they do so, they will write a comment, and if not, it proves our point. Whatever the outcome is, we will be right. Oh my, it seems like we detained quite a bit. Please enjoy the rest of the video. Since Kirby's return to Dreamland, the staging of bosses and finals were prioritized quite heavily. It's not like they were uneventful before, since past entries already introduced memorable fights to some extent, but you can clearly see an increase of care when it comes to creating immersive clashes. Other platformers are often victims of predictable patterns, with unorganic attack patterns and formulaic flow of fists. Just like with copy abilities, I wasn't necessarily expecting the same kind of quality like in past games, since they maybe need to figure out how bosses in 3D work. Kirby's Blowout Blast did a fairly convincing first impression, and after fighting the Beast Army a couple of times now, I can safely say they fulfill their job. To be honest, I have the feeling it is still not what three-dimensional Kirby bosses could really be, but just like most features in this game, the transition into 3D proceeded effortlessly. There's not a single boss which can be considered disappointing, since many of them attack with multiple skills, have more than one phase, and overall carry the legacy of amazing boss fights. Some of them did feel a little too safe, like Gorimondo for example, but this is complaining on a larger scale. I proudly claim that 2D Kirby games have the best boss battles in the genre right now. However, I cannot say the same for the Forgotten Land as long as a game named A Hat in Time exists. Obviously, I'm not going into detail why these fights are absolutely outstanding and unmatched so far. One specific information though is the fact that A Hat in Time bosses feel like clashes against actual antagonists. There's no gaminess or predictable pattern behind them. They don't feel like faceless necessities at the end of a world because games require one to have. You basically never know what could happen in one of these fights next, and there's never a parameter you can go with to predict how many hits are left, for example. Naturally, I will never stop criticizing the health meter of Kirby bosses, but other than that, I hope Kirby enemies are going to lean more towards this kind of clash in the future. The Beast Army commanders already feel like actual characters, so I would have loved to see some more unexpected events in a couple of fights. Silly Dillo stands out as the exception, and although he lacks with attack variety, his fight is full of charm and visual humor. There are also mini-bosses, and there are not many of them, but who cares for mini-bosses in a Kirby game, so let's take a look into the climax instead. I spare you my thoughts about the elevator scene because this moment deserves its own video if I'm completely honest, but everything else surely needs some comments. But it's hard to really criticize anything about this ending due to how much is going on, not only in comparison to other platformers but games as such. For some reason, many franchises think it's not important to leave an everlasting impression and end their adventures with bare bones final chapters. There's nothing more worse than fighting the ultimate enemy and be ready for another phase, only to realize that's it, and you sit there with the unsatisfying feeling of craving more. Well, fortunately, this is never the case with Kirby, quite the opposite to be honest, and Forgotten Land is no different. So what's the problem? Just like the last 4 titles, the whole final plays out rather formulaic lake at this point. People who started with the Forgotten Land will probably be confused, but every Kirby game has a certain pattern at the end. You get a boss battle to get into the mood, revelation what the story is actually about, sometimes another fight, some kind of transition, and eventually the true final boss. As long as this pattern works, there's nothing wrong, right? I don't know about you, but I find myself checking off these boxes in my head while playing this game, just quote, waiting for the true clash to happen. DDD appears? Yeah, it's the pre-fight, so go on. Leonga? Obviously not the end, since there's a huge embryo in the background. We are being chased? Well, this is actually kinda interesting. I think you're understanding my point. Maybe this is only a me problem, but I cannot get fully immersed into what is going on because of my anticipation, and I miss the days where Kirby Finals truly surprised me with whatever was going on. Planet Robobot is a fitting example. No one expected to play a Star Fox section, which is actually better than most Star Fox games during the climax, and I wish the Forgotten Land would go for something unexpected again. The elevator scene kinda set the mood for a very unusual tonal shift, but unfortunately the rest was everything you would expect from a Kirby final. I feel like the creators are scared to tone down the amount of battles, for example, due to how it could be perceived as disappointing only fighting 2 bosses instead of 1,000,000. It's all about the idea and execution, so I truly hope they will mix up the climax next time. Of course, this doesn't mean I have nothing positive to say, and reflecting upon the ending, without the potential of what could have been, it's just as outstanding as ever. Sometimes I get the feeling we are so used to stupendous Kirby finals that it becomes really hard to appreciate how much care is put into them. Even the most skeptical Star Allies player cannot deny how stunning the ending played out, and it's pretty clear how a good amount of the budget is spent to make sure a Kirby game at least finishes on a high note. I do like my gimmicks, yet I'm also glad the battle against Factor Alphalis is so straightforward and free of situational tricks. An honest test of skills, and quite a challenging one on top of that. While we're at gimmicks, however, the mouthful mode left much to be desired. Using the game's gimmicks somehow during the climax is a given, and I was looking forward seeing what kind of wacky idea they would come up with. Will they use an already existing mouthful object and put a new twist to it? Or maybe something completely different that would only work in the context of the situation? The result is a mixture of both, and while I cannot deny the fact that running over the demonic entity with a truck has somewhat of an entertaining ring to it, it isn't as creative as I hoped. The second Factor Alphalis started to summon Planet Pop, I instinctively expected Kirby to mouthful his home planet and crash Alphalis with all its might. Or maybe King DDD would have returned after fending off the beast and you capture the king. There were some slightly more exciting possibilities, but again, it's complaining on a high note and only proves how you can always improve despite performing perfectly fine. Despite focusing on only 3 main factors about Kirby and the Forgotten Land, this retrospective only dived through the surface when it comes to fully analyzing the game. Even then, I didn't go into full detail, but I hope it was enjoyable nonetheless. There's still many things I haven't mentioned, like all the optional stuff like the Waddle Dee Town, Colosseum, figures, properly dismantling the level design and all the worlds, graphics, music, and so on. Although the Forgotten Land is a relatively short game, I feel like I could talk about it all day. And since this isn't a proper review, this day will surely come in 10 years. But let me know how you feel about the first 3D entry after 1 year, and if you enjoyed this more unscripted style of retrospect. Normally, recency bias lets us overlook the downsides, which is why some games can become more debatable as time goes on. In the case of the Forgotten Land, however, with each passing day and with each new playthrough, I'm more and more amazed how well the end result turned out to be, but more on that in the future.